Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, very happy that you're back from your lunch and that we find ourselves again for the afternoon session. Our first subject of today is going to be making sense of science anticipation for a concrete impact. But before we get to this session, I just wanted to repeat once more what I said yesterday, which is the importance for GESDA, the partnerships that we can establish. And I explained yesterday a little bit that we differentiate between two partnerships. One is a partnership which is helping us really in the running of our organization, which I think is exemplified with La Fondation de Genève, who is a co-sponsor of the Breakthrough Radar. But there is a second one that we are starting to building up, and for what we have and are creating an impact forum, which is then afterwards a partnerships that we want to create in the future for the implementation of some of the solutions that we can have. And you remember I talked yesterday about the different financing models for one and the other one. So today I'm very happy and I'm very proud to have with me Anousheh Ansari, who is the CEO of X Prize International. And I would like her to talk a little bit about X Prize and then afterwards about a common project that we have. But first of all, Anousheh, please, some words about X Prize.
Thanks, Peter. I'm very excited to be here and be part of this amazing forum because we've been behind the scene working together and now we have an opportunity to share the great work that many have done with all of you. But it really gives me pleasure to announce our partnership with GESDA because our philosophy and way of work and how we see the future, not as a dystopian future, but as a future of possibility and hope, it's something that we share and it's a deep belief at X Prize. What we do at X Prize Foundation is we look into the future and try to co-architect with the world, a future that we all desire, a helpful future, an abundant future for everyone. And then we look at how do we get from here today to that desired future and what things need to move, what breakthroughs need to happen. How can we accelerate that future? How can we solve some of these big challenges that we face? And we do that through a means of large moonshot competitions. We've been doing it for 26 years. It started with a competition that I and with my family sponsored to commercialize space. This is in early 2000, late 1990s, 2000. So I know you've seen a lot about space in the news and people are investing in space. Back then, it wasn't like that. And what that model proved to us that these types of large moonshot competition can bring investment, can create awareness, and can really drive innovation in a way that nothing else can. So with that prize, which was $10 million, there was $100 million invested in the 26 teams who competed. So there is a multiplier effect that these types of competition bring. And an area that no one was investing or there was no activity, all of a sudden became a very vibrant area of work. We also succeeded in making policy changes that no one believed would be possible. It took 10 years, so it wasn't an overnight success. But that model proved that this type of competition can solve really complex, big problems in the world. And that's what we have done over the past 15 years, expanded our focus in areas like climate and energy, AI, quantum and deep tech, health, space and exploration, food waste, water, and many other areas. When I heard about the work of GESDA and the areas of focus that they have, it aligned with our work perfectly. We've been looking at ways to get more engagement from teams and universities and partners around the globe. And this was the perfect place and perfect way for us to basically expand our footprint for the first time outside of US. So I'm very excited. I appreciate the camaraderie that I've seen amongst all the participants, and look forward to launching this partnership with the first initiative around quantum, which is part of the quantum initiative at GESDA. A lot of conversations around a quantum competition, which helps us get ahead of the game instead of following the game when it comes to quantum. I think with AI, the world is playing catch up. With quantum, we can't afford to play catch up. We have to actually be ahead of the game. And this opportunity to launch a quantum competition and also have the policy conversations around it, which is equally important, is an area of focus for our partnership initiative.
Well, thank you very much. I think it is a wonderful example of our first partnership for impact. And I think it also will allow to start with the democratization of the quantum technology, which I think is extremely important from what we have heard about the last days, that those breakthrough technologies and science, the scientific breakthroughs, don't stay in the hands of 2 or 3 multinationals or 2 or 3, 4 governments. And by having a worldwide competition on quantum technology, I think it's a first step for democratizing and for making it available to everybody. So thank you very much. I think it's also a good example, and this is our second task that we have as GESDA, is not only to create and to participate in solutions, but also to attract new institutions into Geneva. And I think the fact that X-Prize has decided to establish itself for the European part in Geneva and perhaps not in some other cities which were already being discussed, I think just confirms that GESDA can perform also in this task, which is very important for the city of Geneva and the government. So thank you very much, Anouche. I know you are going to be sitting here now in the next panel, and I would ask Karin Chestin, who is the moderator, to come up and to invite her panel, and we are all looking forward to your session. Thank you very much.
Sure. I think this is excellent news. Thank you very much, Anouche. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to you all to this plenary session dedicated to translation. I'll ask my fellow panelists or members of the panel to come up and join. Please feel free to take your seats. Translation, in other words, how to make sure that the expected scientific breakthroughs highlighted in the radar serve society well and serve it well in the global, inclusive, ethical framework GESDA stands for. How to do that best. As said, my name is Karin Chestin. I'm a philanthropy advisor. I'll be moderating this session, and here we have our fellow guests. I'll be joining them. Anouche has already been introduced to you. On top of being the CEO of the X-Prize Foundation, she's also a member of the GESDA Diplomatic Forum. We have Maria Katawi, who is joining us as a presiding officer of the global board of the Open Societies Foundation, coming to us with a distinguished career at the crossroad of world business and global economy, spanning 20 years at the World Economic Forum, and then leading the International Chamber of Commerce, which for more than a decade. JD Cruz, in charge of strategy and planning at UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. In this capacity, JD incubated and is now overseeing 91 accelerator labs. I'm sure you can tell us more, but in developing countries to address challenges across the sustainable development goals. And this is really serving the applied end of science and technology. And Patrick, who doesn't need any introduction here, I'm sorry, a vice chair of GESDA, but maybe for the purpose of this panel, I'll say that he's an MD and a neuroscientist. You're also the co-founder of 3 biotechs and a venture capitalist. I'm sure all of you remember the time where we didn't have this, a computer in our back pocket or in our hands in the form now of a smartphone. I'm saying that not only to ask you to turn it off and make sure it's on silent, but also because I would like you to ponder for a few seconds what this tool has brought to you in terms of immense access of opportunities, but also in terms of threats and risk. And one panelist earlier today mentioned the risk to the mental health, particularly of the youth, due to the apps that we are probably consulting too often. Could we have anticipated them? Could we have prevented them? Think about it. The iPhone was introduced less than 15 years ago. And today, through the radar yesterday, we heard about breakthrough in the next 5, 10, 25 years. So this is the timeline we're talking about. Scientific and technological developments are headed our way, whether we like it or not. Many of them with the potential to disrupt radically our lives, to transform them for the better or for the worse. A few of them to question, as Patrick would say, who we are as a species. Translation is the third pillar of GESDA's mission. Anticipate, accelerate, translate. 2 years in the making of this fabulous venture. It's still a bit early stage, but it is a vital element of its value proposition. And we already heard yesterday a member of the board saying that it is about crossing the valleys between the science and scientific development and society. We heard earlier this morning, Peter Maurer saying we need to build bridges maybe to cross those valleys. So I was pleased to hear that already in all sessions, we have that idea in mind, how to serve society, how to make it happen. We've also heard that it's not just about leveraging the potential, but probably also sometimes framing the developments. So how to act on the foresight generated is what we want to explore in this session with you all here physically present with us, but also the community online. We will be doing that to become concrete through 2 topics: quantum technologies and cognitive enhancement. Now, don't expect us to really deep dive into those topics, first because there is a session this afternoon on quantum. There was a session earlier this morning for some of us on neural rights, but we want to use them as ways to concretely explore how we can do this translation. Before we jump in, may I ask you, Patrick, as representative of GESDA, to give us the definition of translation in your terms?
It's to bring the discoveries of laboratories to us so that they can be used by the society in general. And this has been, in universities, we have 3 missions, typically the discover, which is the research part, the transmission of the education, but I think we have this third very important mission, which is translation. I will say that, we paid by the taxpayers and we have to give back to the taxpayers, the benefit of our research. But of course, this is not just a question of academics, it goes much beyond. So I think that's where you have to set new rules, and specifically in the domains we're going to speak about, that are quite sensitive. So I think we need frameworks to go. But that's what is exciting, and that's the raison d'être, I would say, of GESDA, is we have a couple of both in neurotechnology and in quantum, 2 areas that we start to believe they're going to be, significant for the future of our species. And I would say, hopefully, we're sufficiently early so that we can master their application. We can master the translation. And I think that's at the philosophy of GESDA.
Thank you, Patrick. So we'll start with quantum technologies. And as a total layperson, I admit, what I understood is that through the groundbreaking properties of quantum technologies, we will be able to have an immense transformation potential, both in communications and encryptions, in computing power, in sensing, imaging, measuring. We need now to explore what are the opportunities and risk. For that, we'll look really at quantum computing. And I'm turning to you, Anousheh, because you just announced this collaboration with GESDA. Tell us, what do you expect out of this competition? How is it going to work about how to make it a success?
Thank you. Quantum computing, and because computing is in the title, always makes people think about hardware, the computer, the hardware. And it could be misleading when you look at the state of technologies from a hardware perspective to think that you will see anything significant in terms of quantum computing that will impact our daily lives in any near future. However, what has happened is the hardware field and the software field are advancing independently, and the software field is advancing much more rapidly. And it's advancing because we're finding ways to basically get more information out of our existing hardware and combining them in very creative ways. So quantum software and application is developing much faster than I think most people anticipated. And that's the reason that we feel it's important for us at this moment to have this type of competition and dialogue so we can get the world engaged in it, because it's still in a very limited, groups of people who can know what's happening in the field and discuss it. And everyone else is like, oh, it's not going to happen for a long time. So that's why it's important. We're looking at the application side. We're looking at some of the applications that could bring great benefits to humanity, as you talked about. Quantum simulation applications are of great interest. It can be used to model more accurately through simulation things in health, in climate, in material sciences, to allow us to create new materials, new medicine, and do a lot more detailed modeling of our planet and the complex ecosystem of everything coming together. It has great business application in, just traffic routing, sensing, as you mentioned. And the part that everyone worries about when you say quantum, everyone thinks about quantum encryption and our society being in danger because, all the RSA codes will be broken. That's why it's important for better encryption work to be starting now. So we're not left with our entire banking system and financial system and governments in jeopardy. And these are the areas that we're considering for a quantum competition. We don't have the specific ones picked yet, but we're looking for financial partners, brain trusts and collaborators to help us identify some of these.
Okay, thank you, Anousheh. One of the key challenges, as you say, is to ensure that we have real cases that answer real life problems of real people in context. JD, you have a lot of experience that with the accelerators lab we mentioned. So how do we make sure that it answers, it really gives back to society, answers real needs?
Thanks, Karen. And I think in a lot of our work, in working with communities on the ground to try and solve the big challenges we work on, climate change, sustainable economic development, but also creating societies that have the foundations of governance, the social contracts that work for everyone. One of the things, of course, we realize is very important is the sheer diversity of context on the ground within which we work. Now, traditionally in our work at the UN Development Program, in our minds for the longest time, we looked at this as a question of, can we go into a context, can we understand the problem, and can we then bring in from the outside the best possible solutions to help people? But the reality, my friends, is that's not how our work works. We, as practitioners, spend most of our time sensing, testing out, sharing solutions we find in the context within which people are already solving them. Most of what I have done as a development professional at UNDP has been to go to a country, talk to people to understand the problems they're facing, and say, you know what? I saw this thing someone's doing in that country, and I saw this thing someone else is doing in another country, and perhaps if we combine those two, we may be able to find a solution here. I am not the person providing a solution. And I make this point because I think as we think about the potential of the kinds of technologies we're discussing today, we should not only think about how we can create solutions that can then be taken to solve the problems of poor people in remote islands or communities living in arid countries. We need to figure out how very early on we can build a conversation with them to understand what problems they are perceiving and how we can mesh together the potential of technologies like this with the needs that they perceive. One of the biggest mistakes I have made as a professional, and I think I speak for many of my colleagues, is to assume that privilege of going and thinking, I will understand your problem. So in UNDP, with the labs and with many of the other initiatives we're working on, what we're doing is building capacity to better understand and sense within the context we operate in, not just what the problems are we are seeing, but the emergent solutions communities are developing on the ground. And then building the capacity to connect those with the potential, the capacities, the developments at a global level that are likely to impact them. And the reason we find the work of GESDA and initiatives like this really interesting is because one of our biggest challenges is being able to contextualize in those local contexts what's coming at us as a result of the technological developments in the pipeline, so that we have the ability to build those conversations and those solution spaces on the ground before these technologies overwhelm them.
If I understand well, then a competition is really about casting the light on the topic and raising the awareness in different circles, and then going as wide as possible to have the participation bottom up.
Absolutely. That's the best part of using a competition, because not only it really invigorates the innovation amongst people from all over the world, but it creates an awareness around the subject. As I was talking about space as an example, quantum is in the same place. There's, again, a small community of interested parties who know about it and know what's happening, but most of the world doesn't know or care about it. And I think they should, because it is going to impact everyone's life, and they need to have a say, and they need to have a seat at the table to have a hand in how these solutions are developed. And the goal of the competition is to really invite the world in a conversation, in a collaborative innovation activity around specific topics that are directing this massive potential of this technology toward solutions for humanity.
Thank you. Maria, if I may turn to you. I understand that in the momentum and the beautiful start we are having here with this first summit at GESDA, that Open Societies is also now considering becoming a partner to GESDA. Would you like to tell us more, and what do you think GESDA could do in the field of translation, or should do in the field of translation?
Well, just to say that the Open Society Foundations have already started their partnership with a first preliminary grant. We certainly will be continuing such support in the future, but even more important, we want to work very closely with GESDA in exactly this area of the translation. And as far as this subject is concerned on quantum, I do want to pick up on what JD and Anusha said. And JD, I don't need to repeat what you said, but just perhaps associate my thoughts with how important both of your efforts are. Peter, at the start, did mention the obvious about quantum computing. First of all, we're not there quite yet. We're about, but it isn't at the moment widely applied. It isn't a purpose. It is for the moment in the hands of a few corporations and governments. And you're all right. Quantum is not a purpose. It's a use. It's a powerful, powerful tool. And its interface with AI is probably going to be extremely important. We mustn't forget the other side, which you've called the software side, and which is the interface with something that we do have some experience about, and which I think that we also know some of the problems involved in. I think the biggest challenge for us, and which I think many people, many in philanthropy, but also many in policy, and Open Society Foundations is political philanthropy. It's interested in policy. It's a powerful tool, but we don't want to fight against institutions, businesses, corporations that are in the middle of developing this powerful tool. I do believe that GESDA and its partners can do something that's really important, because together we will have that credibility, and I think we will have that authority. And that's that the pivotal use of that combination would be to make sure that the major first uses, the introduction of quantum computing and the use of AI, will actually be used for those questions, as you have said, those questions that are going to have the greatest impact on society. This isn't given. It's quite all right. Quantum computing will be used to, I don't know, the public street lighting system of Mumbai, which goodness only knows needs a lot of help. But that is simply not enough. And I think that what we need to do is to be sure from the start that there is not a monopolization or a diversion of the actual application of such a powerful tool. And that's something that we need to do together. And that's why I think that GESDA and its partners can be a kind of pivot around which those kinds of ideas, decisions even, and public involvement and knowledge is going to be vital.
My understanding is that the power of quantum computing will allow us to consider level of complexities that are nearly unimaginable today, and that they will provide massive optimization opportunities. Again, if we think, or if we try to project ourselves at the summit number 4 or 5 of GESDA, and we come back together here, what do you think we'll be able to report, and next to the competition, what it will deliver, what else is needed to cross the valleys that we talked about?
Maybe let me pick on the earlier panel of decarbonization and climate issue, and maybe use that as an example. So if that's the area that we will launch the competition in, it will really give us a much better model of our climate and how small changes can make a big difference. So if we have limited resources and we want to decide where to apply those resources, this type of very detailed, accurate model can help governments make decisions in how to spend their resources in having the biggest impact possible. Or Dr. Quinn talked about material science and new material that we need. And I think quantum will have a massive impact on ability for us to really advance the field of material science significantly, come up with new material, and that has the right strength, capabilities, and price points. So I think those would be 2 examples that would be exciting to see in the area of climate. But there's many applications, that I said, in health and other areas as well.
I see JD is already ready to jump in. Please go ahead.
Sorry,
No,
my face
pleasure.
is not a good poker face. I guess 2 answers in this one. To me, one of the most exciting developments by us creating a platform that connects the potential and the momentum of science and technology to the needs of people on the ground is perhaps in GESDA Summit 4 or 5, all of us marveling at the solutions that were developed that we never imagined. And in our work with the accelerator labs and others at trying to find and shine a spotlight on the innovations that we find on the ground, not just in tech hubs, but in Sudan and in Chad and in Somalia and in Bolivia and in Colombia, the thing that always excites me is the unexpectedness of it. Given the capacity, given the connection, people on the ground find problems to solve that we had never even seen. Maria, your example of the streetlights in Mumbai, absolutely. But imagine if 1 million young people in Mumbai had the ability to tap this technology to solve the problems in their lives that we aren't even seeing right now. Around exclusion, around gender rights, around governance, around the ability to have voice in the way in which societies function. So that's the first. Now, because it's after lunch, and I think if I don't say something controversial, we'll all fall asleep. The other bit, of course, is I wondered for a while whether the availability of processing capacity at this scale actually brings us to a point where optimization of decisions in society around resource use, consumption, etc., becomes more effective through a central planning system than through the market. I.e., with quantum, do we move to a world where actually central planning becomes more effective than market signals? And what would a world like that look like? I see heads nodding, which amazes me. I thought I'd be pitchforked out of here at this point.
You won't get heads nodding.
So maybe now is the point to say
No,
that.
I would like to dispute.
Please.
Yes.
So let's go right ahead.
No, in the spirit of open society and
Yes.
open debate, I would have creeps over thinking that a highly powerful computing possibility would lead to more central planning. As I think it was, who was it, an American, Will Rogers, I think, who said, be thankful that you don't get as much government as you pay for. And I would be thankful not to have as much central planning as a quantum powerful machine can possibly pay for with our money. No, I think that the first thing you said is the more exciting, that it is the unknown use and the unknown results and the unknown area, that the innovation is something, and I believe that maybe we should be just a little careful as we have been in the not been in the past, of thinking that our technologies provide answers, whereas we're only feeding into the technologies the questions we think need answers. So there's still that human factor that we're feeding it. Well, for the moment, we're not at the crystalline sense of, yes, wait till you come and tell us that artificial intelligence is really there and we're all being replaced anyway. But until that moment, I think it is the excitement of innovative minds around the world about which questions need to be answered, or which questions more likely not answered, but looked at and provided with options and ideas. So that's where I would only say that gives me a little bit of a jitters on the central plan.
Sorry, and I think with democratization is a big part of this conversation, that if we give access and the information, it doesn't have to be centralized. It's just that everyone can make an informed decision.
And we have to make the choices about how we govern this in a way that steers us in that direction and not the other. I think we've woken people up now. So.
So the point I wanted to make is just to tell the audience here and online that you can send in online the questions in the chat, and there will be a moment for your questions. So get ready. You have panelists that are also ready to certainly to debate with you. Maybe one last point before we go to our second example, which would be neuroscientific developments and cognitive enhancement, is on the topic that was addressed yesterday by Marie-Laure Salle about, do we need here, exactly to Maria's point, the hybridization between social sciences and hard science, and how do we make that happen, actually, to be able to feed or to ask the right questions. And I would like us at some point to come back to this point. Patrick, are you ready to move and frame us on the next challenging topic?
A very simple topic compared to quantum.
As you say. So the very simple topic is, cognitive enhancement, which appears, and for those of you who were in earlier sessions this morning, as highly positive, as most applications today are within, let's say, the security of a hospital and with doctors under Hippocrates' oath. So it's about helping patients to recover, it's about repair, so all positive ideas. But future developments, however, may lead to fear for our integrity. But I'll leave it to you to frame all the challenges that are coming our way, Patrick.
I think, the brain is one of the ultimate frontiers, we'll agree. And people may not realize, but you're here at Campus Biotech, which is one of the most important translation neuroscience institutes in the world. So this is really at the heart of what we're trying to do. I think, just as a reminder, the brain, because of its complexity, was a bit lagging behind the other fields of cardiology and so on. But there was a tremendous amount of research, done in the last decade, so that now we could start to see, application, translation. Okay. But, we're still in the toddler's years, and as much as we've been able to, improve, we still have huge challenges. One of them is, of course, cognition. Can we, slow down or even stabilize cognitive decline that goes with age? Is, of course, as we heard later this morning, we are now thinking and having technology potentially to extend quite radically life expectancy. But it is just to be a vegetable. It may not be very important, very interesting, and be a huge burden to society. While we do this, and we, of course, we are seeing a potential other application. Let me give you just an example. We spoke this morning about read and write into the brain. Read in somebody who's locked in, that cannot interact, we would all accept. Read in our brains, probably less. And the same thing about writing. But I think while doing this, we're pushing the boundary. And I think, human enhancement of cognition is probably the ultimate, because it defines who we are, And the first thing is we have to apply. First, is it for our species? Is it individual or the whole species? Let's say, do we want to enhance our cognitive activity? But we tend to forget we could do the same thing in other species, non-human primates. There's some quite amazing and frightening work going already today in the world about non-human human prime chimeras. So we stopped them at 18 days. But you could imagine going further, and you could imagine theoretically having a species between us and non-human primates that would maybe do works that we don't want to do, maybe probably cheaper than to have a robotic system. So this is one thing on the species. The other part is as we continue, and this is a good example of this place here, to try to understand what is the basis of cognition. And I would say the ultimate thing is consciousness. Now, I'm not taking you to tell you that in 5 or 10 years we'll be there, but I cannot tell you that in 25 years we will have made significant progress. So you could imagine endow, let's say, a robot with some level of consciousness. And that's the kind of thing that we need to frame today. And I think that was the reason, la raison d'être of GESDA. Another important point, until now, this kind of research was done mainly in academia. Today, it goes beyond. Certainly AI is very much present in the GAFAs and the big companies. It's certainly in some of the med tech companies also in terms of deep brain stimulation and so on. So we always think that we need frameworks. We had a very interesting in the neurorights, talk about governance, about self-regulation, ethical guidelines, binding regulations, and ultimately international, laws, rights of laws. But this will take time, and I think people will have to obey by it. My concern is, will, let's say, the big philanthropy follow them? There's a very good example, for example, on stem cells in the US. The NIH forbid at the time, we could discuss or not, it was right or not. But immediately philanthropy came, okay, and allowed those scientists to do what the government, what NIH didn't think they should do. So I think we have to have this discussion with the big. Now, Jeremy is here at this meeting, there are huge foundations that are as big as the states. Will they follow us or not? And of course, are the business related linked to human rights or not? So I think we're at the very sensitive time, in the sense that we need those technologies for the good application, and certainly to treat better the disease of people today and tomorrow. But at the same time, we have to decide how far we want to go as a species. And I think this is the crucial question. And I think if we don't start to think and work on this with the policymakers, with the philanthropists, with the entrepreneurs, that's where the translation that looks feasible needs first to be discussed. I think that's probably one of the most important things. So I think we need, to create the principle of responsive behavior. And I think that's probably one of the most important and difficult things, because for the first time in our history, it will concern us and what we are.
Well, now you know where the challenge is. So talking about reining in or being able to put, a framework that everyone agrees on. In our earlier conversation, JD, you said that you are always amazed to see how policymakers and governments need to catch up and always underestimate the speed at which things are coming our way, what you call a governance gap. So how can we reach that governance gap in order to bring them to the table, make them aware and be able to decide now? And who else do we need to bring to the table and how?
Maybe just a last little remark, because I think there are instruments in this town. For example, WIPO. If you talk about translation, the ability to patent something is critical. If you, let's say there's an area, let's say you cannot, protect technology X or Y that is related to human or to cognitive enhancement, of course, you will not totally prevent, but you will take the incentives out, certainly from the private sector. So I think we have to think about what are the instruments, and I would say IP, the possibility to protect the intellectual property is key. Maybe it's the grant or not the grant, but this, I would say, probably government are ready to do, even though it's going to be a huge work. Will the big philanthropy come in? And there's philanthropy in philanthropy. So how could you bring those various stakeholders into, and again, this for me is really the raison d'etre of GESDA. And in this town, just a couple of hundreds of meters ago, you have institutions that have, in fact, that are instrument that can help or not the translation of technology.
So economic disincentive pattern. I think you have a couple of other ideas that could be disincentive in allowing not to publish or in allowing not to speak in scientific conferences.
I think that this morning was very interesting on your right. You know, we're all in favor of totally open science, anything, but should we be allowed to do anything? So if something is not in the realm of what we think as a species we should do, probably we should not allow it to publish it, to present it, to fund it, to protect it. So I think we have, but now we don't have this debate. And I think what is absolutely urgent is to have, you know, this consensus. And we know this is going to be probably one of the most difficult because it's complex in, I would say, probably simpler matters. But when you go to what we are, which are our mental status, we touch at probably the most intimate thing of what we are. And that's why it's so sensitive. But I think as a neuroscientist, I think it's urgent.
So let me just allow you to just react to what Patrick said,
Exactly.
and then with a couple of
I
questions.
think both of you wanted to react.
No,
if I
yeah,
make
yeah.
sense first. So, right. And I'll try three things in very rapid fire. First of all, in terms of cognitive enhancement, I think we are, and I'm the least expert person on this panel on this, but I think we are already in the early steps of the chessboard. If you're familiar with the chessboard analogy of exponential growth, you mentioned those infernal devices. I remember being young enough to remember probably 100 phone numbers off the top of my head. Today, I can barely remember 2 because I just looked them up. Same thing with directions. I grew up with maps. I used to know how to use a compass. Today, I can barely walk down the street without firing out Google Maps again. So our hybridization with technology is already, I think, in those early stages of the chessboard. And as you all talk about with quantum, with neuroenhancement, we're possibly hitting the tipping point where that becomes profound. Now, you're perfectly right. In order for this to work for humanity and not against humanity, we need to be able to come to a consensus around how we govern these technologies for the benefit of all. In order for that to happen, first and foremost, societies, individuals need to trust the mechanisms of governance that we have right now. And in many parts of the world today, that is not the case. Secondly, these would have to be conversations that need to happen in multiple governance frameworks. It's not just, if I can be blunt, the decisions that are made in the US, in Europe, and in China. It is how do you create the space for these conversations to take place in the developing world, in the 170 geographies in which UNDP operates. And our challenge in that space, which you talked about, Karen, is we all talk about the potential of exponential growth. My own sense is human beings fundamentally struggle to understand what exponential growth actually means. And in our work with policymakers, we all struggle to really internalize what the implications of these technologies might be in 5, 10, 25 years. And it is very difficult for policymakers to form policy that is credible and that is positive and that supports these developments if they cannot understand what exponential growth in neuroscience or exponential growth in quantum actually means. So to me, and the reason I am here is I believe somewhere in this platform in GESDA, we need to find the capacity to be able to really help people understand what exponential growth in these sectors means, and to help them form the structures and the systems to create policy and regulation and government, which is ultimately choice and values, that enable us to use these technologies positively. And we are not there yet, far from it.
Yes, well, I'm going to be a little bit of a dissident again, I'm afraid, in this. I could not agree more about the problems that could be raised and what you said. But I'm not sure we're at this stage of the developments that it's useful to say what's right and what's wrong. I'm not even sure we know it. I have not seen, and my history may be very limited, any technology that has come slowly through this breakthrough phase and that has had many, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, and all of it has been done. So I just question, whoa, a minute. Do we start by saying this is banned, that can't happen, and this can't happen, because with our current and even with a lot of help around, I wonder if we really know where this is going. I am fully in agreement, and even more than you, that only by ensuring that debate, by ensuring that everywhere in institutions, in governments, but above all in the public, with businesses, with, of course, with the scientists, but that debate is probably the most important part, rather than immediately putting the confines on, because I have never seen in history that that has worked. The confines are always broken. Changes in moral perceptions, changes in acceptability, things change. IVF even. Yeah. I mean, it was, when I was young, that was just completely immoral. So there are things I think that we need to follow, and that's where perhaps GESDA and organizations such as Open Society Foundations, UNDP, yours, and the scientific community can be helpful. That is, we have to follow it step by step, not preordain, I think. It's for me, preordain, because it's bound then, those somewhere in the world, somewhere, intelligence is not confined to just 3 or 4 countries. Somewhere in the world, that's going to be broken. And we will have not ensured the debate to handle even that breaking. So for me, the most important thing is that we open that debate. Yes, we argue for limitations, or we argue for no limitation, but we make it part of our discourse from the start and not after. And that we really, really honestly understand that somewhere those boundaries and at some point are going to be broken. How do we follow along with our own moral, public, political, societal development as these things move forward? That's what I would argue for. And that's where I would argue that GESDA and its partners are going to be absolutely, absolutely of the most basic need to make that happen.
Just briefly to add, I 100% agree with what Maria was talking about. I haven't seen anything that was able to be completely shut down by just preventing people from doing. It actually brings more attention to it, negative attention to it. But I want to use, and this is not just in human augmentation, neuroscience, any of the exponential technologies we talk about can have negative impact on the world. If we look at the development of the nuclear bomb and nuclear weapons, it was not intended, but it was an unintended consequence of research that happened. But until everyone understood the potential destructive nature of it and could personalize it, it was still something that was okay. And right now, everyone agrees that we need to basically go to zero nuclear weapon status. So unfortunately, sometimes we have to do small experimentation. And that's why doing it openly in an open society where these types of experimentation can demonstrate the destructive side of things will bring people together, governments together, and collectively make that decision, a conscious decision by the individual not to do it versus being told not to do it.
So I hear you all, and I know you will want to come back in, but I hear you all say we need to build a new consensus and hence have debate in the communities with the people. But don't we need new professions for that? I mean, who are the science debaters? Who organizes this debate? Who mediates science to make it understandable within different cultural frameworks? I think we're missing literally those people who can get us to that new consensus.
Yeah, and one of the major issues that I see is the exponential development. So we all agree that we need to build this consensus, to discuss it, and this is me. But overall, we have this phenomenal acceleration of things that are not going to, necessarily, not as good and bad, I agree. But I think we're talking about things at the heart of our species.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably the first time that we do this, that we're confronted with this. So I'm not saying that we should prevent and so on, but I think we should discuss it. And it's overall, we have to have the instrument. And we did it to some extent. There are things that you could not do. You could not do human research on a couple of topics. We know that during the history of mankind, some did. But I think there was sufficient now. So I am hopeful that my worry is that we're losing people. The science is so fast, so complicated to some extent. So the people to grasp, quantum computing, to grasp, cognitive enhancement and so on is extremely difficult. So I think my only thing is we need something because of this acceleration. We need to anticipate more. So there's a kind of urgency that I think the science community starts to, this is rare.
Yeah.
We build this radar from the science community saying, this is it. To some extent, how far should we go? There is something there. And just saying we're going to take time, we're going to think, the problem is how to deal with this exponential nature. And our response, to some extent, just that we have to take things very early on, so that you give us time to do this. And that means you didn't anticipate. By doing this, as scientists, we're not as, we can give trends, but I have no idea where brain research will be in 25 years, okay? But I think if we don't start to say what could be done, we will be too late and we will always be in a catch-up situation, which is more and more dangerous.
Is this the most disorganized panel of the session so far?
I was about to say that I want to thank you for being so autonomous. It's fabulous. I don't have anything to do, so go ahead, guys. But I do want to get a chance for people in the audience to come in. So if you're okay, because we have another 20 minutes to run. So are there questions in the room? Here, we have a lady, a mic will come to you right away. Here as well. Wow, so hands coming up, so get ready.
So while we pull the mics out, quick fire responses. First of all, I agree, particularly on neuro enhancement. The reality of whether or not any kind of regulation can stop that, I think, is close to zero. Simply because even more so than the nuclear physics or others, this is resonating with a very deep human need. We all, not all, but many of us in the room now are at a point in our lives where we are feeling the reality of cognitive decline. Let's be honest, if there was a technology that allowed you to reverse that, how many of you would say, oh, this is morally wrong? One person out of 120. So
could we also use, they're also at the forefront on climate change.
Yes.
We didn't do much, so should we ask them?
Because climate change is a societal challenge. Right. Individual human desire to extend life, which you're already working on, to extend cognition and not to feel that decline, that's profound. Now, coming back to your question, because you did ask a question at some point you forgot about, which is about the skill sets we need to translate this. That's something that we in UNDP have been thinking about a lot recently, which is in this, as in so many areas, we have tremendous capacity in deep verticals. I think a lot of our systems and structures have now optimized to build expertise in very specific niches. But increasingly, the challenges we see in the world require that transversal perspective, that ability to connect across different technical sectors, but also to connect into the very human sets of ideas of values and equity and intergenerational perspectives. So translators, communicators, empathizers. I think in some respects, particularly when you think about the speed at which AI and quantum is allowing us to move computational tasks off our brains to others, it is really going to be those skill sets we need. And we need to start building both the visibility of that need and the platforms and the cohorts of people who can do that translation in order for us as a global society to be able to deal with these big problems. I did, I hope, answer the question.
Thank you, JD. So we have 3 questions coming. May I ask you please to quickly introduce yourself and then to keep it relatively to the point and short if you can. Here, and here for a start.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Marisela Munoz. I'm Costa Rican. I come from the diplomatic and academic communities. I'm still trying to grasp my mind around all the knowledge that's been shared with us in the last couple of days. It's really fascinating and very thought-provoking. I pick on the mention of central governance coming from the United Nations, of course, and this idea of fostering global understandings, which is more to my like. It's not necessarily central governance, but that fostering of global consensual understandings. And I also pick on exponential growth and trying to better explain that for policymaking. And coming from the developing world, I can tell you that that's a big challenge because, of course, we have other priorities at hand. And it's sometimes very difficult to sell this idea of foresight planning. So if we go back on Monday to our different fields of work, could you give us some homework? Could you give us some practical tips for starting this conversation and bridging the gap, let's say? I believe that we are all very enthusiastic after all the knowledge that, as I said, has been shared with us, but we need to start making a difference. And Anusha says that small changes produce big outcomes. So we all want to get on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Homework for Monday. Shall we take the two other questions and then you can choose which one you want to answer? Thank you. I think a gentleman just over here, exactly, and here in the second row.
Yes, hello. My name is Bernard, and I'm head of a local funding agency. I have a question to Patrick Abischer. But let me just start by saying we're in Switzerland. In Switzerland, we have a tendency to entrust the population with complicated decisions. And so my question is, could the GEDSA be a bit more Swiss? In a sense, like you frame it as, anticipation, acceleration, and translation. And translation could be rebaptized dialogue, couldn't it? It's not just about getting people to know what you know. It's maybe also about listening.
Okay,
Maybe
you want to go ahead?
I could take the Swiss question.
Yes.
I think we have a very interesting country for the non-Swiss here, in the sense that we voted nearly on everything.
Yeah.
One day, I remember a couple of years ago, we had voted on parthenogenesis. So I was wondering how many people do understand what parthenogenesis is. But I think this is also the immense quality of this country. And it puts a lot of burden on the scientific community to try to explain what we do, because you need to gain the confidence of the people, to allow you to do whatever you want in science. And we had many of those, and we're always scared to death. A couple of years ago, there was a ban on transgenesis, proposals, one after the other. But at the same time, I think it's the best of the worst system, to a certain extent. If you don't do that, you will not. That's the only way that I know. They took about 800 years of referendum, of continuous referendum to build a culture. I don't think it's something that is scalable. And you see just by the neighboring country, the use of referendum is suddenly misused because you're talking more about the government than about the question that you're being asked. This is not the case, or very rarely the case in this country, because our political system is very different. So I think, yes, it forces us to explain what we do. You need to have the support of the people. But of course, science just in Switzerland is nothing. Science is a global. So as much as it's a model that I like, I don't know if it's scalable.
Other reaction from our panelists?
One thing I wanted to maybe regarding the first question and suggestion on how we can help people understand complex topics. One, I think the GESDA radar is a very good place to start because there's a lot of good information condensed in a very easy navigation that you can find your answers quickly. But in general, I think we need to actually make use of these technologies that we've developed for things like educating. And we have this opportunity to create simulated virtual worlds. If there was a way for people to test out their decisions in a simulated manner and see the consequences of those decisions, then they can be more informed. They don't need to necessarily understand exactly why this decision ended up causing this problem, but the science behind it is not necessary for them to understand. They need to just understand that if we vote and this technology becomes available, these are the different pathways that it has. Now, that introduces another challenge we have here in our society today, which is misinformation. Finding reliable, truthful sources of data and information is a huge challenge. And I think before we go any further with that, we need to fix that problem, which is doable. And then we can talk about where does society get their information? How do they understand how these technologies impact their lives and their society?
Quickly on the Monday morning question.
Sorry,
Yep.
Maria is in waiting.
No, please.
We have such an active panel.
We really are, yes, we are undisciplined.
Go ahead.
As another Swiss, I would love that this was true all the time, but one good thing is that every time we have one of these, we actually change the constitution, which means, and that's where I'd like to come, that these things are evaluative. It is true that it's urgent, but it's also true that citizens are a part of that urgency. If you leave it only to an elite, there's a mistrust of elites today that's extraordinary and that leads to autocracies. So I would really argue strongly that yes, we listen, we learn, but we decide. And people have to be a part of that decision. The limits, yes, there will be limits. There are limits on everything we do. They change over time. They move. The boundaries aren't static. And that's what I argue for, is that we understand the non-static value of this even fast moving, that we can't put total limits everywhere. You can't do that, you can't do that. It only ends up that the wrong things are done. So let's start by doing the right things. As much as possible, get citizens' voices and get the voices of this world pushing that these technologies that we just talked about, these breakthroughs, are used and implanted in our minds the right way. This is the things that are really going to help the most. Bad things will happen anyway. Let's not dwell on them. And slowly move those boundaries. Yes, it has to be a framework, but I think that frameworks that come from above and from a few people and decisions made like that never work. So let's try and do maybe a little bit the Swiss way, but let's try and do it at least the listening, learning, and deciding way of people. Sorry.
No, not at all. I've actually forgotten when we're disagreeing or agreeing with each other.
I don't know either.
We'll figure this out. On the Monday morning question, we can have a longer conversation on this because we do a lot of this now. One, you need to be able to, you need to figure out how to convince the people you work with who make decisions that things are changing much faster than we can imagine. And that number two, decision makers in government need to get comfortable with the idea that you are making decisions in anticipation of the future, as opposed to decisions based on the artificial comfort of the past. Much of policy making is, let's look at 20 years of data and let's look at best practices from around the world and let's choose from that. And given the pace of things we're talking about right now, that is almost invariably going to be wrong. Because a policy you set today is attempting to guide decisions people make on the ground a year from now, 3 years, 5 years from now. So you're trying to set in place directional signals that are actually going to impact 3-5 years from now. This means fundamentally convincing policymakers that their mental frames for making decisions need to change, which means your bosses are going to hate you, but it is necessary. Can we help with that? Yes, I pick up on Anusha's point about simulations. One of the most powerful tools we have seen used by people smarter than me is experiential choices. So we talked about an example. I can't quote names or countries, but a friend of mine who used to have a senior position in a government part of the world that's not here was tasked with this challenge of how do you get decision makers to understand what climate change really means. So he collected a cohort of interesting people, and what they did was they analyzed for the capital city of that country what air pollution would mean depending on different climate scenarios for that city. They then built rooms into which they pumped what the air would smell like in 2040, depending on the choices made. And they had the prime minister and the ministers in that room. When you're in a position where you can smell the consequences of your choices, all of a sudden those choices become a bit real. And as Anusha, as you were saying, with the technology we have now, immersive simulations, people who are, and there were conversations in the room, people who are actually working on the ability to make those not just 3D, virtual, and sound, but actually smells. There are companies here in Switzerland who can work with you in creating that. So use these tools as a way to actually immerse people in the consequences of the decisions. Then let's see what happens. But your bosses will still hate you.
Thank you, JD, for that. I'm seeing the clock ticking. I have my boss over there saying you need to close the session slowly but surely, but I still want to give you each a minute and 30 seconds, no more, sorry, to be able to impart your thoughts and wisdom still to the crowd, and also to react to the two topics we had. What can we learn, and what thoughts can we leave with GESDA for the future?
Well, I would start by saying that we're living in a very exciting time. The fact that we're having this conversation is heartwarming. I think we can get our hands around the issues and work together and use this technology to really build a world we all want to live in, and our children and grandchildren want to live in. And having these types of conversations that will stimulate these types of questions, like what do I do on Monday morning when I go back to my country, is the type of conversation that needs to happen now. Because whether we like it or not, our societies are changing. They're changing rapidly. Our governments are not ready to deal with it. And hopefully this type of activities will get them ready.
Thank you, Anusha. Maria, do you want to go next?
Oh, I really have no conclusion. I don't think there's a conclusion to this. I think there's only, we're all learning in it. I would only ask everybody, after listening to some of the sessions here at GESDA, and perhaps even us, do you feel that you are getting a grasp of some of the issues that we have to decide upon as human beings? Yes? Well, I think that's what we're after. That would be my conclusion, is that we pursue this continuously. Absolutely pursue all the lines from experimentation, democratization, to all the openings that JD pleads for, and some of the concerns, and I would say real worries that Patrick and his colleagues can bring up, and that we keep abreast of them. But more than that, that we convince others to keep abreast of them, because those limitations, those needs for framework, those needs for policy are not going to go away. And we're going to, year after year, long after some of us are not going to be here, are absolutely needed, so that we're not always looking backwards. We're not anticipating so much in the front that we stop things from happening, but that we are always at the edge of where policy, science, citizens, morality, whatever you want to call it, necessity, where they merge right at that leading edge.
Patrick, I think.
No, it's music to my ears, you know, because for us, when we thought about GESDA, was to try to have this debate with the policymakers that are there and take the time to really, you know, starting to anticipate, because, and we know how difficult it will be, but the fact that you are here, that you take the time to do this, you know, people from all over the world and the various disciplines, is for me very, you know, reassuring to some extent, because that's what we need to do. A very small thing, I think maybe for the next, you know, sessions on, I think we also need to bring, you know, let's say industry, cutting edge industry, part of the debate.
I agree.
Because, you know, it's one thing about the sciences, but it's also, and today there are a couple of things in science that are quite advanced. And so if you look at AI, the main AI is not necessarily done in universities now, it is in companies.
Yeah.
So I think we need to bring, in terms of translation, it is very important that we bring also this stakeholder, which is essential, which is the private sector.
JD.
A lot of what we are discussing here is about how we make choices around the future. And I think in my own mind, what I'm trying to understand is where we can set aside attempts at certainty about what the future will be, and build conversations about what are the values and norms and choices we want the world to imbue in that period. And a lot of the translation you talked about, I think, is precisely in that space. Science needs to understand what society values and what society aspires to. Society needs to better understand what the potential of science is so we can make choices collectively about how to use that. Neither of those is happening right now. And you're absolutely right about the business world, because increasingly choices are being made in the business world in the space that neither science nor society really control. And that's a concern.
Very
Well,
much.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for very active thoughts. I certainly retain the notion that it's work in progress and that it is a process, but that it is urgent and we should get to the task. So looking forward to continuing with you. My apologies for those who didn't get the floor and couldn't ask their questions, but as previous moderators said, there is an interactive platform online. Please do put in your comments, your questions, your pledges of contributions. As we heard from all of our panelists, we need to include society communities all over the world, so we need your help for that. Thank you very much, and thank you to this fabulous panel.